This video is sponsored by NordVPN. X-Men fever has swept the nation. Everybody's loving the X-Men again. X-Men 97 was a hit. X-Men movies are coming back. Marvel vs. Capcom is coming back. It's a good time to be an X-Men fan. However, in these last few months, I've been getting one comment more than any other. I loved X-Men 97, but where do I start if I want to read X-Men? And that is something I'm going to try to help you with. Today, we are going to get you into X-Men. But first, we have to have a word from our sponsor.
These aren't ordinary men, they're...
This video is sponsored by NordVPN, and what can I even say about NordVPN at this point that you haven't heard? You know about it, you've heard about it, and you know why? Because it's the VPN I trust most, and I'm not the only one. I make sure to download NordVPN on every device I have, and that's only possible because it allows me to connect up to 6 devices. Whenever I'm on the go, and I'm on the go a lot, I keep that thing on me. Plus, along with what Nord usually provides, they're now offering a voucher for up to 20 gigabytes of data on Saley, a new eSIM data service from the team at Nord. An eSIM is basically a digital version of a SIM card that you can use abroad, and it allows access for faster internet connections while traveling. So that's an additional 20 gigs of cell data. For comparison, that's more than most base level cell plans get monthly. So if you travel a lot like I do, you know how big of an upgrade that is. So if you head over to nordvpn.com/cosmonaut, you'll get a huge discount on a 2-year Nord plan plus 4 additional months free. And on top of that, Nord's going to throw in a voucher for 20 gigabytes from Saley. It's of course risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you don't love it, it's fine. Don't sweat it. In case you missed it, that's nordvpn.com/cosmonaut.
Wolverine! Cyclops! Beast!
Now, as of this moment, at the end of June 2024, Marvel is going to release an all-new line of X-Men comics for new readers. But I do think that if you jumped into one of them, you'll probably still be a little confused, because getting into X-Men is nothing like getting into any other superhero comic. If someone asked me where to start if they wanted to read Batman, I'd just say, read whatever you think sounds cool. Year One, Long Halloween, New 52, Dark Knight Returns, Hush, literally anything you want. It doesn't matter. And I'd say the same thing for Spider-Man, or really any other superhero. But it's different for the X-Men, and the reason for that is pretty complicated. First of all, the status quo for most superheroes has never really changed that much. Spider-Man is almost always a guy in his mid-20s who's down on his luck and trying to balance superhero shenanigans with his regular life. Batman is always sitting in that cave figuring out how he's gonna punch mentally ill people. And as such, their stories can kind of be jumped into at any point. Plus, you, as a person living in the 21st century, already have most of the relevant context needed for these superheroes. You know that Uncle Ben died. You know who Robin is. Pop culture and films and TV shows have already taught you everything you need to know about most of the popular superheroes out there. And lastly, the most important part is that these stories are about one person. It's pretty easy to learn everything about one character. Now, none of these things are applicable to the X-Men. First off, the X-Men status quo changes every few years or so. The aesthetic of Professor X living in a mansion where he teaches mutant children is not really what you're going to be reading. I do not remember the last time I saw the X mansion in a comic. And of course, cultural osmosis cannot be applied to the X-Men. The movies are not accurate whatsoever, and if anything, they'll give you the wrong information about these characters. There's a reason everybody hated Cyclops up until recently. And now he's everybody's little baby girl. And of course, the biggest deterrent, the thing that makes X-Men truly hard to dive into, is the fact that there's a lot of fucking X-Men. You can't keep track of everybody's life. Sometimes there's shit you're gonna miss. And these reasons have led to X-Men being kind of hard to get into unless you know someone who can help you. And that is what I'm here for. Explaining things in a way that anybody can understand is one of the few things I'm good at. So today I'm gonna teach you, yes you, Steven, how to get into X-Men comics. Now this is gonna be kind of a branching route, a choose your own adventure type deal, because most people would tell you to start with one series and just go from there, but I know that all of you are very different people. We all come from different walks of life. We all have very busy schedules. Some of you like reading everything and being a completionist, and some of you just want to get to the cool shit immediately. So I'm going to run through a few paths you can take depending on how much you personally want to read. I'll try to give you the vibe of each comic without spoiling anything so you can tell if it's something you want to spend time on. And where applicable, I will try to give you guys a falling off point where you can drop the run and move on to the next comic if you want to. Because there are like 50 years worth of comics here, and I don't expect everybody to read it all. It's gonna take a long time if you want to do that. Also, near the end, I will have a section where I talk about X-Men stories that you can enjoy without really needing to read everything else. I would call this the standalone stuff, but there's not a lot of it, and even the ones I recommend will require some additional context. Also, before we begin, just to make it easy on you guys, I should say that all the comics I'm going to recommend today can be found on Marvel Unlimited. For a very affordable price, you get access to like every comic that's come out up until like a year ago. They don't give you the new stuff because they want you to go to the store and buy those yourself, but if you're trying to catch up on anything, this app is super helpful. They also have reading guides for newbies and a full list of what to read if you're on a crossover event. This part in particular is very useful for this video, alright? I'm going to give you guys the list of the comics in order, but the app just has them right there, so, you know, you're saving yourself a lot of legwork. Anyway, let's start with the start, I guess. What do you read first? Now, some people out there might ask me, why don't I just start with X-Men issue number 1? Don't do that. See, X-Men premiered in 1963. They were created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, as most people know. However, it sucked. It was kind of boring. It really wasn't their best work. And it was so bad, in fact, that it got canceled. But then, in 1975, it got revitalized with Giant Size X-Men number 1. And regardless of who you are, I think it behooves you to at least read this. This one single comic establishes a lot of the core X-Men you know today. Nightcrawler, Colossus, Storm, Wolverine, they all debut here. Okay, technically Wolverine already existed, but I don't count that. I don't know that guy. As the name implies, this is a thick, chunky single issue, but it sets up the status quo that X-Men will follow for the next few years. And the events of this comic are referenced and touched upon over and over in comics to come, so I highly recommend this one. The next thing to read is what most people will say is essential X-Men content. The iconic Chris Claremont run. This is the direct follow-up to Giant Size X-Men, and it begins with Uncanny X-Men 94. This is the run that defined the X-Men as we know them today, and most of the core iconic storylines are found here. Days of Future Past, Dark Phoenix, etc. Now you may ask, when do I stop reading this run? Because it's really long. So, I'll tell you what I did. Around issue 101 is where I personally started really getting into it. Because this is where the Phoenix saga really starts, and honestly, that shit is pretty good. That's a good chunk of comics. And after that, things don't slow down either because we get the introduction of Kitty Pryde, and then Days of Future Past happens, and there's really just a lot of other stuff going on. It's worth continuing. If you're really enjoying reading this, you can keep going until you get sick of it. But I know some of you, I know most of my audience has Zoomer, TikTok, ADHD, and to be honest, Chris Claremont X-Men is not a breezy read. He can be very wordy, and most of the dialogue in these comics are just the characters reiterating things that you may have read in the last issue. It is a very classic way to write a comic, and you do need to have a taste for classic comics. Personally, I enjoy this style of writing, so it's much easier for me to read it. If you're the kind of person who likes old stuff but does want to dip your toes into more modern comics, I can say you can fall off around issue 201 if you feel like it. Even that's probably a bit of a stretch. I do strongly believe it's okay to skip around if you want to, because not all the stories in this run are created equally. Sometimes, it's okay to skip the issue where Storm gets kidnapped by Dracula. Now, many diehard X-Men fans will say this is sacrilegious, but don't listen to them, listen to me. These comics were written for little kids to randomly pick them up from the shelf at the supermarket, okay? They're written in little chunks. Don't feel bad if a certain storyline isn't catching your fancy. You can skip it if you want. Even if you do skip it, Wolverine's gonna remind you in the next issue what happened anyway. But honestly, I thoroughly enjoyed mostly everything between issues 101 and 201. That is like 100 issues of X-Men, and I think 100 issues gives you everything you need to know about classic 70s X-Men. If you're the kind of person who reads this and thinks, God, this really isn't my jam, I do not like this old style of writing, then I think that's perfectly valid, and for you, I have an alternate route. There is a graphic novel that summarizes and chronicles this era of X-Men, called X-Men Grand Design. Now yes, for those of you who know, the now late author has had some recent controversy surrounding them, but he is dead now, so your money isn't really going to him anymore. And I personally see this as less of their original work anyway, because it really is just the Cliff's Notes of Claremont's extensive X-Men history. It's like Claremont X-Men Abridged Edition. Personally, I read both just to kind of see the difference, and they're both very valid ways to get caught up on classic X-Men. Now, after that, we have decades and decades of X-Men comics, and honestly, they can be kind of hit or miss. If you want, you can jump in on the Jim Lee era and read some of that, but personally, it wasn't my jam. Even though these designs are iconic and this is probably the X-Men you're used to seeing, the stories really just aren't that exciting. But the first few issues are fun enough so you can read that opening storyline and move on if you feel like it. But after that, that's when we get to the real shit. This is where I'd say the modern era of X-Men begins, with Grant Morrison's New X-Men, starting with New X-Men issue 114. This is the definitive start for everything that the X-Men experience in the 21st century. So many core ideas and concepts begin in this run. This is where Emma Frost first joins the team, a character that will remain relevant for every single storyline leading up until today. It establishes Cassandra Nova, a villain that more people are going to get to know once the new Deadpool movie comes out. Quentin Quire, Phantom X, Zorn, the Stepford Cuckoos, all of these characters will be relevant in future comics, and the events of this comic are also going to be referenced endlessly in the decades following. New X-Men is so influential that some of the best parts of X-Men 97 are directly adapting this run. Now, this is one of my favorite, if not my number one favorite run for the X-Men. I really like it. The one thing you'll have to endure as a new reader is probably the art. Personally, I can stomach the art from this era, but it's not pretty a lot of the time. This run has quite a few artists, and some just aren't very good here. It's not all bad, and I personally love Frank Quitely's art in this run, but he's only around for a few issues. The standout issue visually is issue 121, where Jean and Emma go on a wordless psychic adventure. There's not a single line of dialogue until the final page, and it's probably one of my favorite single issues of X-Men ever. But outside of Quitely, the art can be very hit or miss. However, it really does make up for it in the story. But if you really aren't feeling New X-Men and you want something that looks a little prettier, I'd say you have to at least read the first story arc, E for Extinction, and then feel free to move on. However, I do think you should read this. This is the good shit. It will also provide you so much crucial context for future stories, and really the run isn't that long either. It lasts from New X-Men 114 to New X-Men 154. Now the next comic after Morrison's New X-Men is Astonishing X-Men, written by Joss Whedon. Yeah, Joss Whedon wrote an X-Men comic, and unfortunately, I think it's really good. Now there are a few caveats here. He doesn't write the best Emma Frost, he doesn't seem to know what to do with Wolverine, and there are few, not many, but a few unnecessary quips. However, everything else here is on point. This is very much written as a standalone story, but it will rely on you knowing what happens in New X-Men, because, again, New X-Men is very important for all the context in this era. I think that while New X-Men is what made me appreciate X-Men more and it got me hooked, Astonishing X-Men is what cemented X-Men as one of my favorite superhero franchises. It also placed Kitty and Cyclops as two of my favorite X-people. There are moments here that are among my top X-Men moments of all time. It feels so focused from beginning to end, and it ends in a way that is so insanely satisfying. I really love the ending of this story. It's so fucking good. Some people will tell you not to read this because of Joss Whedon, but honestly, if I didn't read this, I would not be as big of an X-Men fan as I am right now. Anyway, now we move on to the mid and late 2000s, and this era is wholly defined by one singular crossover Marvel event, House of M. You've probably already heard of this one. I mean, you've probably already read it, honestly. This is an Avengers and X-Men crossover that will change the status quo for the X-Men and the Marvel Universe as a whole. This is another one of those things that is so important that I'd say it's probably essential reading. You straight up need to know what happens in this comic before you move on. It's also worth noting that this is kind of a cool story for Wolverine. If you've read up to this point, you might realize that a lot of authors just don't know what to do with the guy whose only purpose is murdering people. But his role in House of M is very unique, and it made me like him a lot more. And after House of M, we reach the Decimation era of X-Men comics. Personally, I don't really love this era that much. It's very much a downer. This is where the X-Men hit a very low point in their morale, and it feels like everything is just going to shit for them all the time. But I do think there are a lot of cool stories in this era. However, most of them are what I'd consider to be the standalones, so I'll probably bring those up later. The next event is gonna be a big one, and it's the Messiah Trilogy. This is basically 3 major crossover events that smoothly go into each other, starting with X-Men Messiah Complex, followed by X-Men Messiah War, and then X-Men Second Coming. And the event is chronicled in these issues in order. This might look confusing, but if you're reading on Marvel Unlimited, they will have all of this in order for your convenience. This trilogy features the next important event following House of M, and it gives you a little bit of Cable action, who we haven't really seen much from yet. The last big event from this era is going to be X-Men Schism. For me, this is kind of where the 2000s X-Men era ends, and while I do like Schism, I don't think it's entirely necessary for anyone who wants to speed run to the current X-Men comics. This is a period where Disney acquired Marvel, but did not acquire all of the rights to the X-Men and Fantastic Four. So as such, in an attempt to devalue the X-Men brand, it is believed that they made X-Men bad on purpose. Now, there are some fun comics in this era, but again, I'll cover those in the standalone section. If you want to propel straight to the current era of X-Men, there really is nothing stopping you from here on. The actual final event, before we get to what I consider to be current day X-Men, is technically Avengers vs. X-Men. I'm only putting it on screen for those of you who are morbidly curious, but honestly, this story is dog shit. It's horrible. Everybody involved in this story is an idiot. The Avengers are dumb, the X-Men are dumb, nobody makes any sense, the fights are handled horribly. Honestly, just don't even read it. Forget I even told you about it. Now, for the years following Schism, X-Men were nobody's favorite superheroes, and this dark period lasted up until 2019. Yes, that's a big jump. But thankfully, this era of X-Men is widely believed to be some of the best stuff ever written. This is the Krakoa Era. This era of X-Men is nothing like what we've seen before, and it takes the characters in a direction that is new, exciting, and a little creepy, but like in a good way. This era begins with House of X and Powers of 10. It's kind of like 2 series that make up one series. You read them in alternating order, starting with House of X number 1, then Powers of 10 number 1, and then House of X number 2, and then Powers of 10 number 2, and so on and so on. Again, if you read it on Marvel Unlimited, or if you go to the store and buy it, it'll be compiled in order. Now, some people will say that if you have a passing interest in X-Men, you can jump right in and enjoy this story no problem. I think those people are a little crazy, okay? Because back when I tried getting into X-Men, I tried doing that. I picked up this comic, and I was like, dude, what the fuck?
Dude, oh my god, dude.
Oh my... This can't be real.
I need to sit down.
This can't be
I might
real.
actually puke. Get back a little. I might puke. Stay back.
It's possible to jump on with this one if you know at least a decent amount about the X-Men, but I only returned and read it for real after I read all the previously mentioned comics and events, and I felt very rewarded for doing so. The story feels like a love letter to everything the X-Men have experienced up until this point, and it does serve as a big chance for the X-Men to become cool again. Characters that were introduced years ago are given new importance. All the major events that we've read so far are referenced. If you read everything I outlined before this, you will truly feel rewarded when you get to this story. And this story sets up most of the recent era of X-Men comics, and this is where things get a little freeform as far as the reading guide goes. But as far as recommendations go, I'd say you could just read X-Men, like just the one called X-Men, starting with X-Men number 1. This is a continuation of House of X and Powers of 10, and it will give you additional context for this new era. I also strongly recommend Hellions by Zeb Wells. For those of you who only read Spider-Man and you think Zeb Wells is the worst thing to happen to comics, grow up a little bit, I guess? I don't know. Yeah, his Spider-Man comics aren't very good, but this dude can write some fucking mutants, alright? Hellions is basically the X-Men version of Suicide Squad. It's funny, it's a little bit sad, and it'll give you a new love and appreciation for characters that you normally do not give a fuck about. I came out of this series loving Mr. Sinister of all characters. I don't know how that happened, but here we are. Now, one thing worth noting while you read comics from this era is that sometimes you might be reading a series and it gets interrupted by an event. In case that does happen and you want to read the full event, the 3 major events in this era are going to be X of Swords, the first Hellfire Gala, and Jonathan Hickman's Inferno event. From here on, this era kind of goes into a lot of different directions, and if you see a series that looks cool, you can probably just pick it up and enjoy it just fine. I will say that after Inferno, if you read anything, I definitely recommend continuing reading X-Men, like just the one called X-Men, as well as Immortal X-Men and X-Men Red. These series were written neck and neck and follow the events of the Hellfire Gala and Inferno. And honestly, this is some peak X-Men. If you don't like this stuff, I don't know, go read One Piece. Now, this era of X-Men comics surprisingly does not last very long, and as of the time of me making this video, the era literally just ended. And that ending is going to be chronicled in the 3 stories I listed above, as well as the Fall of the House of X and Rise of the Powers of 10 series. It goes in this order, and since it just finished, Marvel Unlimited probably doesn't have it all yet, but by the time you get to this point, it probably will. Honestly, the Krakoa era has so many damn comics, so I might have missed some stuff. I personally haven't read it all yet, because there's a lot, okay? If you've made it this far, you've already done most of the work. You're probably already an X-Men fan, so you don't really need my help anymore. But hey, what if you're looking at me and you're saying, that's fine and all, but I don't have time for all that. What if I want to read some cool shit right now? I have a few stories that are mostly standalone, or they can be enjoyed with little to no extra context. Most of these are still going to require at least a little knowledge, but you'll probably get by just fine. Firstly, we have X-Men, God Loves, Man Kills. This is like the X-Men graphic novel. This is the one that people are always going to recommend to you. It's what inspired X-Men 2 and so many other adaptations. It's a simple but effective story that gets to the core of what makes X-Men great. It requires basically no prior knowledge to read. It's probably the easiest one in the bunch. Number 2, New Mutants. Now this one's going to be a little more extensive, alright, but hear me out. Let's say you've seen this girl around and you think to yourself, damn, she looks cool. What X-Men comics do I need to read to learn about her? And the answer is none of them. She's not usually an X-Man, she's mostly a New Mutant. The New Mutants are a parallel group that go on their own adventures. Their original run was going on at the same time as Claremont's Uncanny X-Men run in the 70s. A good place to jump on is around the Demon Bear story arc, and you can continue on into the Legion story arc. And if you want to learn who Magic is, you want a little more context about her, she has her own mini-series that you can read. It's pretty cool, and it's not that long. If you're really enjoying the New Mutants, I recommend continuing the Claremont run from here because the art honestly is so good, it kept me reading. But once you've had your fill, you can probably move on to New Mutants Volume 3, which takes place after Schism and is also by Zeb Wells. Yeah, I told you, this guy can write some fucking mutants, okay? But yeah, knowing what happened in Schism might help you a little bit, but I think you can probably do without it. Oh, and the New Mutant run in the Krakoa era is also pretty good, but I think you probably need to have read other stuff to figure out what's going on in that one, so your mileage may vary with that one. But yeah, the New Mutants are like X-Men adjacent, but for the most part, they kind of keep to themselves. You do kind of have to go out of your way to learn more about them. Anyway, our third recommendation is Uncanny X-Force. See, the X-Force is a Black Ops mutant team that's full of people who are A-OK with killing and murder. This comic looks cool, it has sick moments, it features characters that you probably already like. I think this is one of the few comics where I actually like Deadpool because he's the one weirdo in a team full of super serious assassins. Now, having context from the previous X-Force comic might help a little bit here, but to be honest, I read this comic before I ever read any of the other X-Men stuff, and I really had no problem understanding what was going on. Oh, but you probably should still read New X-Men so you know who Phantom X is. New X-Men is very important. Number 4, X-Men Red, the Jean Grey version. Not this X-Men Red with Storm on it. This one. This story takes place right before Krakoa starts, and it honestly serves as a pretty good transition into that era. This story features Jean, who's recently come back to life for like the 7th time, and she decides to use her new life to make some big changes in the world. The story's pretty short and sweet, and it made me like Jean Grey a lot more. As usual though, it helps if you've read New X-Men before you read this, at least the first few issues. New X-Men is really important. Number 5, Exterminators. This is set in the Krakoa era, but honestly, it doesn't really require a lot of context. Because this is a silly story where Dazzler, Jubilee, X-23, and Boom Boom fight vampires and say naughty words. It's not taking itself very seriously, and it's meant as a fun little side adventure. It has some very funny interactions between the characters, as well as some pretty cool action. Now next, we have a little bit of a bonus round. These stories aren't really about the X-Men directly, but they will serve to show you alternative mutant adventures. The first bonus round comic is Ecstatics. This is a personal favorite of mine. This one's about a group of mutant celebrities who have to deal with their interpersonal drama while being manipulated by media and capitalism and greedy media producers. Also, they sign on to this team knowing that any of them can die a horrible death at any moment. It's basically simultaneously an action story, a soap opera, and a reality TV show. My 3 favorite things! This story actually starts in X-Force issue 116, and it continues on in the X-Static series. If you really like these characters, you can also read the Dead Girl miniseries with Doctor Strange. I think that one's pretty cute. Also, I think these guys have a Krakoa Era book, but I haven't read that one yet. I like these characters a lot, and I don't really see a lot of people talk about them, so they belong on the list. Next bonus round is one that I only recently started, and it's the Madrix miniseries followed by X Factor Investigations. These stories are centered around Multiple Man, a mutant who can create duplicates of himself. He uses these clones to solve mysteries and murders. Sometimes, he even has to solve his own murder. I'm actually still reading this one, but I like it a lot, and Jamie is quickly becoming one of my favorite mutants. It's a good one for people who want more grounded, low-stakes mutant adventures. And lastly, the final bonus round comic, as well as the last recommendation of the video, is going to be Astonishing Spider-Man and Wolverine. I almost didn't want to put this on here because I think Spider-Man fans get enough media to consume, but I also know my audience, and I know what you guys want. And this is a very fun story about Peter and Logan getting displaced in time and being forced to work together to get back home. Much like Exterminators, this one is having fun with itself, and it is kinda cool to see a story focusing on the 2 moneymakers of Marvel. And that's it. We're done. You did it. Give yourself a pat on the back, because I know it wasn't easy. I hope that this video was enough to get at least a few of you into X-Men. Of course, there are a few holes in my list, but overall, if you find something that you're missing context on, you can easily find it and go read it for yourself. This is kind of just meant to be a beginner primer for new X-Men fans, and at a certain point, you'll probably realize which parts of X-Men you enjoy, and you'll go and seek out those comics for yourself. There's really no wrong way to get into X-Men, but it can be overwhelming, so as usual, if you guys find this helpful, please let me know. And if it wasn't helpful, keep it to yourself.